And so we have with us, and please give them a big hand, Lawrence O'Donnell and Senator Michael Bennet. Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. This is the book. I intended this to be a writer-to-writer discussion about this book. I love this book. We might get to it.
It doesn't, yeah.
Because some things have come up. I don't know if you've heard about this on the campaign trail. There's some stuff that by the time you get back to Washington, let's just say you might be a juror in an impeachment trial in the United States Senate. So
I read something about that.
You can do your homework about that on the plane. But I have a question for you that comes directly from the president. It's from 9 days ago, before we saw the transcript. The president tweeted, "Is anybody dumb enough to believe?" Let him finish. Is anybody dumb enough to believe that I would say something inappropriate with a foreign leader while on such a potentially heavily populated call? And so the question to you, Senator, is, are you dumb enough to believe?
I am dumb enough to believe that, Lawrence. I'm sure you're not, but I am dumb enough to believe it. I'm dumb enough to believe that he told the Russians in the Oval Office that he didn't care whether they interfered with us or not because we do the same things in their elections, which came out yesterday.
This is moving faster than anything I've seen, and I guess I'm old enough to have seen the two previous impeachments of my lifetime. Looks like we're heading for a third. The smoking gun in the Nixon case, which everyone agreed was a smoking gun, including the Republicans, which was, once again, it was the president's words. It was first a transcript and then an audio tape of the president's words. That came out a year into the impeachment investigation. Right. Has it thrown you all off balance that the smoking gun came out in the first day of the official impeachment investigation?
I mean, it does make it totally different than with Nixon. It would be like if Nixon had said, "Oh yeah, actually I put that tape on the door at the Watergate on the first day." And it took the Congress to do their job to find it. So it's totally different in that respect. But I've been thinking a lot about Watergate recently. I mean, there are a lot of people now that don't remember that time. I remember that as, you know, in a way, that was the darkest moment in our country's history in a long time. Nixon and Vietnam were going on at the same time. In a weird way, that reassertion of the separation of powers, our democratic institutions working, to see senators working in a bipartisan way to get to the truth on behalf of the American people and to defend the Constitution, that wasn't something that you could take for granted when Richard Nixon was president, and it was a moment when our democracy tried to heal itself, or when the American citizens and their elected leadership tried to heal this country, and that's what I hope is going to come out of this, one way or another.
What do you see in the way the House has so far organized their approach to this? Do you agree with this six-committee approach, concentration on the phone call? Part of it goes to the Intelligence Committee?
I do. I'm on the Intelligence Committee in the Senate, so there's going to be a lot of overlap in what they do in both places. I think this is an opportunity for us to play a complementary role. We haven't decided in the Senate where it's going to end up, but that's where it is starting. And I think the Speaker knows what she's doing, so I'm not going to second guess her on this. Mm-hmm. She's had, you know, she's been extremely disciplined all the way along here. It hasn't been easy for her to do, but when the President of the United States, you know, confirms that he has asked a foreign leader to investigate one of his potential opponents, that sort of forced her hand, I think. There's nothing else she could do. And then, by the way, said there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. You have two sets of voters to respond to on this matter. One is Democratic primary voters in the presidential campaign as a candidate. The other are Colorado voters, all Colorado voters, Republicans, Democrats.
Exactly.
Do you see a challenge in trying to speak with one voice to those two sets of voters?
It's just such a great question. For me, not at all.
I spent a lot of time.
Excellent job, Lawrence. Excellent.
I worked on that one on the plane.
It is. And I wish that more people thought about it that way. I mean, Colorado is a state that's exactly a third Democratic, a third Republican, and a third independent. Exactly. And one of the people that wrote that op-ed in the Washington Post the other day, who said, you know, we have not been for impeachment proceedings, but now these freshman congressmen said we've all served in the war, as did Jason Crow, who's one of these congressmen. And at a certain point, you just get to a point where you got to do your constitutional duty, and we should go through the proceeding. It is going to be enormously important for us to, as I said earlier, treat this like it is an exercise, in the most solemn exercise in following the rule of law that we have. And we are going to, in the end, have to satisfy the American people that the action we're taking or we're not taking can be supported by them when you impeach a president. That's what we did with Richard Nixon. You know, I mean, as you were pointing out, it took a long time to develop the evidence there. It also took a long time for the American people to decide it's time for Richard Nixon to go. And we're going to have to go through that process here. It may take less time, you know, one way or another for us to resolve it. But I do think if a simple way of thinking about this is how to swing voters in the suburbs of America that gave the Democrats a majority in the House, that has now led them to be in the position to be able to make these decisions. How do they come to think about what this investigation looks like on the one hand and what the president has done on the other?
I think still in the field might be the largest group of Democratic senators that have ever entered presidential primaries together. You are all potential jurors in an impeachment trial, which would probably be either getting on the way or possibly in the middle of it during, say, the Iowa caucus. Has anyone thought about how the presidential candidate senators could possibly juggle those two things?
I think it's an easy choice for all of us, and that is that first and foremost, we've been sent there to do our job, and that is our most important job right now. We have to take it seriously. I'm going to make sure I'm there every moment in the Intelligence Committee long before we get to any sort of being a juror, and that is the way it's going to be. There are people who have been asking me the last couple of days, do you think this freezes the presidential race, you know, to have this impeachment going on, which if you're at 1% in the polls, as I am, you're sort of interested in knowing whether the race is going to be frozen or not. I'd like to know. But I think we can't tell. I think we have absolutely no idea, and the most important thing for all of us to do is our jobs.
Well, one of the struggles you're going to have in the presidential race is getting real estate in, say, hours of programming like mine.
Absolutely.
Where I don't know what you could have done on Wednesday or Thursday as a presidential candidate to get into any of that coverage, right? So you will be watching days go by where the campaign itself is not covered by those kinds of shows.
I can think of some things, but they would have led to your arrest, so it would have been better not to. Yeah, I agree, but that is what it is, you know, and we've been bumped off the front pages. We're bumped off the front pages of your show and others, and I think I imagine what other people are going to do is what I am going to do, which is to continue to communicate with voters in the early states, in Iowa and New Hampshire, and also do our job at the same time.
Now, you as jurors, you have the strangest role as a jury in our system because, first of all, we all know who you are. You all became jurors when you took your oath of office before this process initiated. It's a constitutional formulation that makes you a juror in an impeachment case. You can also talk about the case at any point. Right. And in past impeachment processes, we've seen senators say, I think this is absolutely not an impeachable offense. Basically, jurors announcing their verdict before the trial even gets to them, some of them during the trial, and then most of them toward the end of the trial, will then get up and make a speech saying, I think this rises to that level, or I think it doesn't rise to that level. Have you thought about how you want to conduct yourself as a juror?
What I want to make sure of is that not just for me, but for anybody, that if we make a decision in the end to impeach and then convict, or to vote to impeach and then convict, that that vote can be defended in America, that people don't think that it's a rush to justice, that people don't think that we took the evidence seriously, because the worst thing that could happen here would be for this process to become so politicized, and that's what Donald Trump's going to try to do with this process, is to make it so politicized that the American people who are those swing voters who are going to make these determinations in some ways lose faith in the process. And that's why I'm approaching it the way I am. Somebody said to me, the essay reporter from Politico, I think it was, well, you've been so cautious about this. I don't think I have been cautious. What I'm thinking about is the end point here. And if we are going to sustain this politically in the end, we need the American people to know we did our job seriously, we took it seriously, the guy wasn't railroaded, the president, and that we let the evidence and our conscience be our guide, and that we can defend it. That's what you have to do in a democracy. This is not exactly a jury trial. I mean, it is a political process in many ways as well. And even though he may have, I mean, I've thought for a long time, for example, he committed impeachable offenses that showed up in the Mueller report. That didn't necessarily make me think that it was the moment to begin impeachment proceedings. I feel differently now.
How surprised were you that Mitch McConnell, at the first stage of this, agreed to a unanimous consent request from Chuck Schumer that these documents must be released?
So that's not just a good question. That's the most important question that you're going to ask, and here's why. I've been in the Senate for 10 years, and I want you to hear me say this, because if I get hit by a bus on the way out of here, someone else will know this and you can carry it forward. I would never, ever want any of you or my children or anybody that I know to be as cynical or malevolent as Mitch McConnell. Ever, 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 ever. But here's what I wish for Democrats. I wish we could be as strategic as Mitch McConnell. And the other day, which we have not been, on judges, on climate, I mean, the list is so long and so painful of his running circles around us while we have not been as strategic as he has been. And man, let me tell you something. When Chuck went and asked, I knew, because I had talked to Chuck before, I knew that McConnell wasn't going to object. But when Chuck went out there and said, I request unanimous consent that we allow, that we tell the administration we want you to send the whistleblower's complaint to the Congress, and Mitch McConnell went to his desk and said, I do not object to that. You know what I knew? There was one person in that chamber who knew what was in that complaint, and it was Mitch McConnell, and he was happy for it to come forward. You gotta watch this stuff, because it's the only way. It's true, it's totally diabolical. But if you don't pay attention to it, you'll miss it, and he'll slip you the shiv every single time. And that can't happen here. It can't happen here. He said yes, not because he was saying this is an important moment in our democracy's history to enforce the rule of law. He said yes because he believed, maybe rightly or maybe wrongly, that the complaint wasn't really going to hurt President Trump very much.
Are you open to an alternative theory on that from a former Senate staffer?
I am.
He worked in the Senate so long ago. It was in the days when Mitch McConnell was a reasonable human being. the early 1990s, and he was, which would be so shocking to you. He was one of the reasonable people on the other side of the aisle. When I saw McConnell do that, I thought, McConnell knows that they are going to get this document eventually. And so
Could be.
when they're asking for something that legally they are eventually going to get, you have to ask yourself only one question: when do I want them to get it? Because they're going to get it. So I'm looking at it, I'm saying, okay, if they have to struggle all the way through the United States Supreme Court to get this, they're going to get it. McConnell's looking at that saying, do I want them to get it a year from now, in September, when I am locked into a nominee for president? Or do I want to get this as soon as possible to find out what the weight of it is while we still have time to change nominees? That's my alternative.
Could be. Either way, he knows what he's doing.
Yes, yes, he does. We agree on that, 100%. Let me turn to this, because I just love this. And I've never asked this question of a politician about the title of their book, because the title of their books are so obvious and simplistic, but The Land of Flickering Lights, that's a novel title. That's just a beautiful piece of writing right there. What does that mean?
Well, first of all, I also forgot to put my picture on the cover.
Right, that's right.
It turns out
and there's no American flag on the
Yeah, if you're running for president, put your picture on the cover. Do it!
Yeah.
And don't call it The Land of Flickering Lights, call it My Story, or The Best Friend You Ever Had in the Senate. What that comes from is I've been there for 10 years, and my arrival in Washington coincided with the election of Barack Obama, and it coincided just months after he was standing in Grant Park in Chicago, and my view was, man, we've reached the pinnacle of American democracy. It was such a glorious night. I was then a school superintendent of the Denver Public Schools. The majority of the kids in my district were kids of color, were poor kids. They and my kids would now always imagine that a president looked like Barack Obama. I mean, it was just, and what I didn't understand was, at that moment, the forces of reaction were gathering. And that 2 years later, they'd show up in the form of the Tea Party, later called the Freedom Caucus. And man, I've been there this whole time with those guys. And I call it the Land of Flickering Lights because when they go out and shut the government down, as the junior senator from Texas seems to have a penchant for doing, and we go through this process where we've kept the government open for 1 day or 2 days or 6 hours or whatever, I always go to the floor and say, this place has become the land of flickering lights, where the standard of success is whether we kept the lights on for another 6 hours or for another day or another 2 days. I called my brother James, who's a journalist, when I was putting the title on. I said, I have this feeling that we grew up with this phrase, the land of flickering lights. He said, I actually was wondering where you got that, because I've never heard anybody use it. And it turns out, if you Google the land of flickering lights, all you get is me, my floor speeches in that book. That's what I meant by it. And I think it's particularly pathetic to consider that we are living at a time when I can pick a billion examples, but my favorite, when the Chinese are building 3,500 miles of fiber optic cable from Latin America to Africa to connect it with their surveillance state in China, and we can't even keep the government open for 10 minutes. We can't even pass a budget. 40% of the time I've been there, we've been on continuing resolutions, which are temporary budgets. None of the stuff that you used to do. I mean, you were the guy on the finance committee for Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And you wouldn't recognize I'm on the finance committee. That's supposed to be the best committee in the...
It was.
Yeah.
What'd you do to it?
We can't do anything.
We left it in very good shape.
It's terrible. It's terrible. And the reason is because in the old days, not that long ago, I mean when you were there, it was
long time.
It was. You still had tons of special interests. All the special interests were arrayed around finance because that's where tax decisions are made and trade decisions are made. But you also had a group of senators who could withstand that and could stand up for the American people and act when they needed to in a bipartisan way. Today we can't do that anymore. Someday we will be able to, but
you have a chapter title in here called The Accidental Senator, which is a title that I considered using for a TV series that I created for my favorite kind of senator, which is what you are, an appointed senator, because I just think there's so much drama in the appointed senator who suddenly finds himself in this situation, which you didn't ask for, didn't see coming, and suddenly there's a vacancy in the United States Senate, and you get the phone call. What was that first phone call like?
Well, it was the governor calling me up and saying, I'd like to consider you. Bill Ritter was his name, is his name, wonderful guy. By the way, if you ever are appointed by anybody to the Senate, two things I'd say. One, if you're a school superintendent and somebody comes and says that to you, tell them you like your job, and you're fine. And the other is you gotta take their call whenever they call for the rest of your life. It was crazy. I mean, at the time, I was actually being considered by President Obama for Education Secretary. I lost that job out to my pal Arnie Duncan, which I knew. I was like the world's biggest stalking horse for that job. I was never going to get that job. But I was in the middle of the hunt for that, and then Governor Ritter said, I'd like to consider you. And it is a bizarre experience. And I started to basically to run for re-election when I was appointed, never having run for office before, and I was 3% of the polls. And the Republican state party chairman was referring to me as the accidental senator, which is why that's the title of my chapter. And while it hurt my feelings, it's also true that it was totally right.
It's real. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people are, you go wander around Telluride or any place in Colorado for the first time, and people are like, who are you? Why are you in that job? And you're kind of thinking to yourself, who am I? And who am I to deserve to represent these people? But it's a matter of doing work, earning people's trust. It's like anything else, and taking nothing for granted. What I didn't know is I was getting launched into the most dysfunctional government in modern American history. And I'm sorry that has been the case, but it's a reason why we all have to dig really deep, not just to beat Donald Trump, but to begin to figure out how to govern this country again. That's what we have to do.
There's no good writing that isn't honest, and that's the risk you run in trying to deliver a well-written book while you are still in office as a politician. And so this is one of those well-written, serious, thoughtful politicians' books that goes to the question that they never want to get, never want to answer, and you write about it extensively. And that question is, what is your biggest regret as a United States Senator?
This is where I'm a jury of one on this one, I think. But my biggest regret as a senator was the day I went down to the Senate floor and cast the vote to change the rules for the approval of judges and executive for administration nominees. We were very frustrated beyond belief, because McConnell wouldn't let anybody through. And actually the final straw was when he filibustered the guy who had been the Secretary of Defense nominee, who'd been a Republican senator, whose name is just not...
Yeah, they'll find it.
Anyway, here we are, we have a Republican. He's been nominated to be Secretary of Defense in an effort by President Obama to kind of make peace with people. And nobody's ever filibustered a Secretary of Defense nominee before, and now they've done it after all this DC Circuit stuff and all this other stuff. And I think, and I write this in the book, that I think that Harry Reid felt, being a guy who's got a really strong sense of right and wrong, that there was a special form of nullification going on here, in part because President Obama was the first African-American president. And after, running up to changing the rules a couple times, he finally pulled the trigger, and I voted for it. I am the only person in the Senate to go to the floor and actually apologize for my part in this. My part in this is so tiny compared to Mitch McConnell's part in this, which includes stiff-arming Merrick Garland, includes blowing up the nuclear option on Neil Gorsuch. But the reality is he got what he wanted. And I think we played into his hands. And people say, well, it would have always happened that way, or there was no way to get around it. I just disagree with that. I think that we could have had another kind of gang of 14 that would have said, let's not go down this road. And here's what I couldn't predict, Lawrence, sorry. I knew what would happen is if you get 51 and it's not a 60-vote requirement anymore, you're going to get people auditioning to be judges by saying, I'm the most right-wing person, I'm the most left-wing. I thought that would come up in the context of Roe versus Wade. You know what it's coming up in the context of? We are now putting people on the court who refuse to say